All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of PAS and Friends Conversations in Black. We're up to volume two, number three. Today's topic, Pan-Africanism, Pan-African Studies, and Black Studies. My name is Tequeme, or W.S. Tequeme, or Professor W.S. Tequeme. Um, I'm here with, and actually am the Director of Graduate Studies for the Pan-African Studies Department at the University of Louisville. And our series here, PAS and Friends, Conversations in Black, like I said, we're kind of deep into year number two. And in a minute or two, I'm going to remove the screen, the PowerPoint screen, and introduce our panelists this evening as we pursue this topic of Pan-Africanism and Black Studies. Um, Want first really to actually to talk about the flyer for a minute, just because it kind of represents some things in terms of why we're having this conversation. And so in one corner we see our logo, the logo of the department, Pan African Studies, and the 50th anniversary banner, which the department goes back to 1973. So that was 3 years ago. But we really still are celebrating the 50th anniversary to a great extent, because we certainly want to provide another set of 50 and 50 and 50 years more down the road. But um, our icon, our long time professor in our department, Dr. Robert Douglas, art historian, designed our logo. You see the continent of Africa, and then he places the United States and Central and South America inside it. I yeah. So anyway, so this department, like going back to 73, it was very considered that they took the name Pan-African Studies in terms of what they wanted to represent, in terms of having a global perspective uh, on Black people and the need for Black liberation. Of course, in the other corner, we see the continent of Africa with the red, black, and green colors will take us back to the Universal Negro Improvement Association and the flag that they designed. Their famous chairman and leader, Marcus Garvey. He'll come into the conversation a little bit today as we talk about Pan-Africanism, I think. And then down at the bottom, uh, you know, I'm sure most of us probably know most of this stuff, but I think it's worthwhile in terms of situating our conversation to actually identify, some of the important reference points that we are about and are trying to follow to some extent. And so we've got Amilcar Cabral, and down in one corner, a return to the source, really one of the foremost of the African revolutionary leaders of the independence movement era, and one who certainly had a lot to say about Pan-Africanism and certainly thought that his work was a part of that overall mission. Next to him, we see uh, we see the great South African singer Miriam Makeba, Mama Africa as she was known, certainly from South Africa, and certainly representing the South African liberation struggle, but also representing the continent, representing the continental aspirations for liberation and unity. And next to her, we see one of the leading members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee of the American Civil Rights Movement and Black Power Movement. Stokely Carmichael was his name then. He would later change his name to Kwame Ture. And when these people got married in 1968, that was actually quite an event. That was actually quite a global Black event, you might say. I mean, yeah, it's on the entertainment level, a social level, but still, in terms of this, uh, what we might say is a Pan-African ethos, they kind of became a symbol of that. Next to them, Nina Simone, the great Nina Simone, the high priestess of soul, someone who, as I looked at her career and her words and everything, I don't see her like quite specifically emphasizing herself as a Pan-Africanist as such, but she certainly was a symbol of that. And without the name, as an artist, as a performer, she exemplified that in terms of her stance on interest in Africa and reflecting Africa in, for instance, the way she dressed there, with the Egyptian mode. Next, we see then two, and maybe even the two most prominent uh, icons of Pan-Africanism during what Howard French calls, this high tide of Pan-Africanism in his latest book. We'll talk about that in a second. We see Malcolm X visiting Ghana in the spring, summer of 1964. And we see him posing in front of this very large statue of Kwame Nkrumah, who was the president of Ghana during the time, and of course was the figure who led that Gold Coast colony to independence, and later certainly as a global advocate of Pan-Africanism, really was quite foremost, Kwame Nkrumah. There's a lot to say about that statue existing while the guy was alive and in office. That may be beyond our conversation here. Let's leave that alone for the time being. But anyway, Kwame Nkrumah and Malcolm X, certainly two icons of Pan-Africanism. The last piece was just an interesting statement that I saw a clip online, Pan-Africanism and the Vision for a Borderless Africa. One of our conversations is going to be what Pan-Africanism means today. What does it mean globally, historically? So that's something to think about. All right. So anyway, that leads us into the conversation we're going to get into tonight. Who are we? Pan-African Studies at the University of Louisville. We have a BA degree. We have a master's degree. We have a doctoral degree. So we got this going. We've been going for 50 years, and we hope to do a whole lot more. If you're interested in pursuing this subject, come check us out. Come check us out. And this series we've been doing for a year and a half now or so. I'm not even going to talk about these things. Here's some of the topics that we've done over this past bit of time, just to once again situate the kind of thing that we've been about here in this topic tonight. Pan-Africanism and Black Studies. But yeah. This year, the Black Civil Rights Movement, we did that. The Black Arts Movement just a few weeks ago. That was quite lively. Bringing us back to today, and once again, our subject, Pan-African Studies, and Pan-Africanism, I should say, and Black Studies. All right, let's see. Let me come over here and trying to, yes, this. All right. So I wanted to stop that for a second. We'll put it back up in a bit. We want to introduce our panelists, and I'm so very happy that we have some stellar people to join us in this conversation today. And all the way from Sacramento, California, we have Dr. Dream, Dr. Andrea Harris, so Pan-African Studies at Sacramento State. And welcome, and thank you for joining us, and we look forward to having this conversation with you.
Thank you, and hello and greetings to everyone in the room.
Yeah, exactly. And then all the way from, I believe it's Toledo, the University of Toledo, on the shores of, what is it? Is that Lake Erie? Which lake is that? I don't even know. Shingi? Mabimi?
It's one of them. I don't know.
One of them, don't even know. It don't even matter. All that matters is I'm assuming it's rather cold there tonight, I would assume.
It is very cold. It is very cold. Yeah, it is Erie. But
you're right. It don't matter.
Yeah. I was ready to leave the office real quick at 6:50 because it was that cold. I had to come back to the comfort of my home, which where I control the heat a little bit. So I'm honored to be here. Indeed. Thank you so much.
Yeah. We're looking forward to it as well. And my friend, my colleague, my co-conspirator from many, many years back, the one and only Dr. Jakia Marie, one of our, you were like our second graduate of our doctoral program here at the University of Louisville. And you've been out doing a whole lot of good things in the years since then. And it's always great when you stop back by to share a little time in some of your adventures and knowledge with us. Dr. Jakia Marie, what's going on, my girl?
I'm in Michigan right now, and the snow is wild.
You getting a lot of it?
Oh my gosh, it was a whiteout coming back home. So I'm excited to be on Zoom And grateful to be in the space as always.
Actually, you look a little bundled up there. You you look a little bundled up.
Yes,
I
very.
I ain't mad at you, as they say. I ain't mad at you. All right. Well, this is our crew, and we are going to say we're going to engage in this conversation about Pan-Africanism. Give me half a second. Yes, I need to get my. I want to get this PowerPoint back up because we have some visual information that's of significant use to us in our conversation. Jakia, you can see everything now, though? You good?
Yep, all is well. I'm good.
Okay, good. All right. So there are two large conversations. What is Pan-Africanism? And then the second conversation, well, Pan-African studies will bridge that. We'll talk about that in a second as well. But Pan-Africanism and what that means today. That's the first part, probably maybe the larger part. But I want to be semi half and half in terms of the second part of our conversation is like what constitutes basic knowledge of our subject, Black studies, like what are like some topic areas, some things like that. So we want to talk about that a little bit. To some degree, that's a follow-up of our very first PAS and Fringe conversations in Black when we took on the subject of what is the Black Studies canon and what are the essential texts. We went through like book lists and talked about that stuff. Today, let's talking about that more than, okay, like what are the subject areas? What are the kind of basic information? Let's start that conversation. We won't finish it. Just as I believe this first conversation on Pan-Africanism, we will start that conversation. We'll get into it. I don't necessarily believe we will finish it. And so let me see. Let me see what I want to do. So the very first thing we're going to do is take on this question: what is Pan-Africanism? And I wrote some of our one-sentence descriptions down, and we'll go through that in a second. But actually, we want to start then with one of our elders, Mwalimu Horace Campbell, a longtime Pan-African activist, longtime scholar. He has been up there at Syracuse University for quite some time now. But in May, we did a birthday tribute to Malcolm X here, and Jakia was there. She was a part of it. Birthday tribute to Malcolm X as turning 100, and our topic was Malcolm X, the OAU, and Pan Africanism. And of course, well, not of course, let me not say it like that. So one of the topics then, what is Pan-Africanism? And so that we had a little bit of a conversation there. We didn't leave a lot of time for it. In some ways, that kind of leads directly into our conversation today. The fact that we really didn't have adequate time to go into it today. But I did want us to first listen to what Mwalimu had to say when it was his turn to answer the question of what is Pan-Africanism. So let's turn it over to Marlene Horace.
Pan-Africanism has always been a wide church, and you'll get as many definitions of Pan-Africanism as there are Pan-Africanists.
Okay.
Where we come from, the Pan-African movement is about the dignity of human beings. Pan-Africanism speaks to a very simple concept that human beings must live on the planet. The first Pan-Africanists were those who were enslaved, who said that there can be no dignity and freedom unless black people are free. The shipmate, the women who were fighting against enslavement. The high point of the Pan-African movement at that point was the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution sent a message to all Africans that anywhere you come from, you come to Haiti. And that is why they're still against the people of Haiti. And so we have been through many different iterations of the movement. But the fundamental question of dignity says that the people of one part of Africa are responsible for the freedom and liberation of their brothers and sisters in other parts of Africa. And indeed, Black people everywhere were to accept the same responsibility.
Okay.
That definition of Pan-Africanism, which was articulated in 1974 by Walter Rodney, has been taken further by women in the Pan-African movement who centralize care, life, peace, health as a fundamental basis of Pan-Africanism in this point. So the principal conceptualization of Pan-Africanism that came from the enslaved is still alive, especially now in this era of robots and artificial intelligence, where they want to turn us into lobotomized human beings. Pan-Africanism is even more important now to go back to the basic principle that we are human beings and we want the planet to be a place for human beings. That's what Pan-Africanism is about.
My man, Walimu. And he gave us a lot there. He gave us a lot there. Now, so one of the assignments for our panelists, I gave you all had one sentence. You had to define Pan-Africanism in one sentence. So obviously he got a whole lot more leeway than you did. Which is cool, He deserves it. He deserves it. So he gave us a lot to think about. And I did pull out a sentence for him when we get y'all in here. But let's take the first thing he said and let's just see what you all have to say about that. Because the question on the table was, what is Pan-Africanism? And he says, hey, he says there's as many definitions of Pan-Africanism as there are people who call themselves Pan-Africanists, which suggests that there's no such thing as actual fixed meaning of the term. Does it not? Would you all concur with that basic idea, that basic notion he puts forward?
Yep, I would. I would definitely agree. One of the things that I try and share with my students is when we look at different people who participated in some form of the movement, it's when they move out of their own ism and their own particular niche that they have been, bringing attention to and start to see oppression as a humanitarian issue that they're typically killed. And once they become vocal about this, even, right? Once they no longer are just advocating for one particular niche. And when I think about the Black intellectual leaders that we talk about often in Pan-African studies, that's a pattern. That has been a pattern. Either they are killed or they have to go into exile for a period of time before they die. I also appreciate the way that he did not put any limitations on it when we think about us as being the origins of civilization and creation and the limitness of that. I love that because it takes off some of the systemic structure of white supremacy. And I really appreciate it in thinking about, in particular, somebody who's coming to my mind right now is Cabral, when he's like, it has to move beyond just race. We have to understand that this is a bigger issue that is impacting and oppressing people. And even the people who look like us may not be for us, may not be a part of actually pushing the movement forward. So it cannot be just because of race. So that's my little my little 2 cents in the beginning of that question. Yes.
Oh, no, great, no, great. And I certainly hope to come back to Cabral, certainly. But yeah. Shingi, you got it. You agree with the basic concept? It's depending on who's talking. Pan-Africanism, what it means depends on who's talking.
Indeed, I think it's something that I tend to concur with, and it's something that's fresh on my mind. As I was talking to Dr. Tekweme here earlier, that I'm meeting I'm doing an independent study on Pan-African with 3 very focused and passionate graduate students. So that's the class I was coming. That's the gathering I was coming out of before this, and that actually the reason I'm referencing that moment is because our heated debate today was with read Kwame Apia's book in my father's house. Sort of to show them to sort of discuss the other views that folks might have on this beloved ideology and project of ours. And in that, and I say this because this was a very important conversation we had, where one of our students, with some very profound insights, but was very, in their critique of it, almost siding with Apia's, naysayer, or sort of, what sounded like Afro-pessimism in parts, was that he was fixated on the idea of whether one nation Africa could work. And I kept trying to come back to say, like, yeah, but when you do that, you're joining him in pigeonholing what Pan-Africanism could be. Because if you are convinced that that doesn't work, and that's a conversation to be had, it doesn't mean then that's the end all and be all of Pan-Africanism, because Pan-Africanism historically and contemporarily has looked like many different things, right? So if that doesn't work,
Okay.
Does the concept of the frontline states in Southern Africa helping usher Rhodesia and South Africa out of colonialism, does that debunk that? Does that debunk things like the OAAU and moments like that are these diasporic connections, right? Does that
Yeah.
so many other things that we've done or that we still have to do that if we decide one thing is not the strategy within Pan-Africanism itself is not it's a worldview, right? It's not necessarily there are strategies within it, and that could be different based on era, based on particular gripe we are fighting against, based on what the enemy looks like at the time, based on what resources we have. And so, yeah, I do agree that it does take many different forms, but though there are basic tenets that have to be observed indeed.
Okay. Well, we asked the question, do we agree with Horace, with Mwalimu on as many Pan-Africanisms as there are Pan-Africanists? And Shakia said yes and then disappeared. I assume she'll show. I assume she'll show back up. Where? Huh? Did I hear? Where are you at? Oh, okay. You back?
Yeah.
Oh, my screen is kind of wacky here. Okay, my screen is kind of narrow. All right. I mean, just want to generally concur, or did you want to maybe chime in on the general question? It seems like people are generally agreeing with the basic notion.
Yeah, agreeing, and also to what Shinky said at the end is people may have different definitions, but it has like the foundation is still the same. So I think that no matter how we define it, we usually get to the same point, right? Like we might take a different route, but we try to get to the same destination. So I think that that's what's most important is that we really are actually on the same page.
Yeah, I heard that. Well, so well, I gave you all one sentence, and so to probably prove Mwalimu's point, everybody said something different. Although I'm sure we could make some harmony between them. But like Shingi said, let's go with St. Clair Drake. The idea that Africans and peoples of African descent in the diaspora should develop solidarity for the purpose of abolishing discrimination, political and economic exploitation, and to leverage their collective position in a modern global system. And so we put it at the level of ideology there. Anyway, St. Clair Drake, certainly someone whose perspective we certainly should strongly consider. Jakia, your sentence was Pan-Africanism today is an ideology advocating for the unity, understanding, and self-determination of people of African descent across the continent and the diaspora. Right? And then my sentence was Pan-Africanism arose in response to the scramble for Africa as a movement for the fair treatment of Black people worldwide generally and the liberation and unification of Africa specifically. And Dr. Dream said an acknowledgement of the lived experiences of people of African descent globally. And then I went into that quote from Mwalimu to pull out a focus sort of sentence, and he gives us once again at the level of ideology, like most of you all responded, that the people of one part of Africa are responsible for the freedom and liberation of their brothers and sisters in other parts of Africa, and indeed Black people everywhere were to accept the same responsibility. Yeah. So those are, if we wanted to sit here and try to like harmonize it, we could definitely create some very significant harmony between them. But these are really essentially like 5 different responses to the question of what is Pan-Africanism. So that would seem to support Mwalimu's first point that he raises. I would be I wouldn't see any basis for arguing that, as you all agreed to already there as well. I mean, for myself, in terms of like, yeah. So when I teach it, you know, yeah. I find myself actually less interested in the ideologies so much in articulations as in the movement, as in like what actions are being taken to change conditions in the name of Pan-Africanism. And so for me, when I answered the question that everybody had to answer, I probably wasn't even answering the question of what is Pan-Africanism. I was answering the question of like what is or perhaps what was the Pan African movement, you know? So that's one piece. I think when I teach it, I emphasize like, the political organizing more so than like, articulations of ideology or sentiment or something like that. And most of y'all kind of went in not the other way, but you emphasize, it's the orientation and the outlook. Um, yeah. Anyway, that's one thing I noticed in our, as we put everything together there as well. Okay, so uh, uh, if we just follow with Walimu just a little bit more than, like I said, that part. Like I said, I guess that part is probably closer to like my conception of things there. But the idea, because he does kind of situate the question of the freedom and liberation of Africa as paramount. And anyway, I'll stop. Anybody got anything else? I'm going to move on to some other points unless anybody's got anything here.
Doctor, I just meant to also emphasize here too, for what it matters, because I say here this is a slightly modified version of St. Clair Drake. So I want to tell you, at least so that we know what I'm, very clear about what I'm working with, what my contribution to this part of the conversation is. My two modifications are, I think it would say eliminate segregation and political and economic exploitation. That's St. Clair's Drake's part. So I've taken out eliminate segregation, not so much because I don't think that it's not an issue anymore, but I think in terms of with at least a politically liberated Africa and other parts of the Black world now, it may be. I wanted to keep the three parts, but think of what a third more relevant thing in the post-colonial era is. So that's why I substituted that for and to leverage the collective position in a modern global system. The other part that I also edited was because of the very, initially its definition said to develop racial solidarity, but also coming to terms with the fact that understanding of race sometimes evolves, and I want to make sure that I've crafted space for our North African brothers and sisters, for example, who technically represent unless you just say somebody else will look at that and say like, well, those guys are not, even if other definitions of race include them. So I just want to make sure that solidarity, just to keep it solidarity among Africans and people of African descent. I think that communicated that. So I just wanted to clarify my own contributions to that definition. I didn't just take it wholesale. I modified those two parts indeed.
No, yeah. Thanks for making that clear, because I did kind of think run over that piece as well. All right, well, in terms of talking about Pan-Africanism, let's see, what did I want to do? Well, just really highlight a couple of books. One of them is very recent. Actually, two of them are very recent. And the Pan-Africanism of History, Hakeem Adi, that's very recent within the past few years. And, that's got a lot of positive attention. I used that one semester in the graduate course. The next time around, though, I went back to the older text, which actually goes back to 1980, but I think, it's been updated in the 90s or something. The Esedebe book, Pan-Africanism, The Idea and Movement. For my purposes, like, or in particular, focusing on the movement aspect of things, a little bit more useful. Even the cover Hakeem Adi's book, I think is suggestive in terms of a rather expansive definition of Pan-Africanism, and he devotes a lot of space to cultural production. And so the cover, I actually had this image up when we were doing the Black Arts Movement a few weeks ago. I don't even know if we got around. In fact, I don't think we got around. One of the pieces in our conversation a few weeks ago was on the visual artist Nelson Stevens as a member, as a participant in the Black Arts Movement, and we didn't get a chance to talk about visual art at all. But as we said back then, that's only the first edition of a Black Arts PAS and Friends. We obviously have to do more there. But Nelson Stevens, who was also one of my professors up when I went to graduate school, up at Afro-American Studies Department, up at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Well, he was on faculty. I won't say he's one of my professors, but he was on faculty there, and he was cool. It was very interesting. Anyway, one of his pieces, one of his best known pieces, worked to unify African people. That's what bore the cover for this recent book by Hakeem Adi on Pan-Africanism, which certainly is interesting and has some value. Like I say, the other one focuses more, because it's more tightly focused on organization, it has more space to devote to the various organizations and such like that. But then I also, just generally speaking, wanted to talk to you all about, just very day, I was committed to finishing this book, which I just got my hands on a couple days ago, the noted journalist Howard French, his book called The Second Emancipation. I had been well, I ain't gonna say I've been looking out for it. I was aware that this book was coming, but only within the past few days did I discover it actually had already been out a couple of months. So I've been gobbling that up the past couple of days. Howard French, a long time, longtime journalist in Africa, author of numerous books on Africa, someone who's really, I think, his career as a journalist focused on Africa, lived over there, lived or lives over there. Anyway, Howard French. Now, so this new book, The Second Emancipation, which I just finished, as you can see from what I'm trying to say, from the subtitle, Nkrumah, Pan-Africanism and the Global Blackness at High Tide. So it tells a fascinating story. Nkrumah is certainly one of the best known of the figures from the African liberation movements of the English-speaking world. He was a world celebrity and all of that. What I want to say, and his book talks about that a lot. But having said all that, there's not necessarily what you would call a lot of good material. And so, yeah, there are numerous biographies out there as well. And so this piece here, which as he makes the point of saying, listen, I'm not here to tell a comprehensive biography of Nkrumah. What I'm here to do is to try to, first of all, remind people who have completely forgotten of the magnitude of this guy's presence in the world, on the African continent, including the United States, of his connections with the United States and how deep they are, and of how that whole piece of history seems to have been completely forgotten in the United States and in the West in generally. And so anyway, the point being to go back and situate this guy so maligned in the Western press. Nkrumah, like I said, Nkrumah's, people who identify Pan-Africanism remember him fondly and such like that, but in the Western, in Western figure generally, no, he's really viewed hypercritically. And anyway, let me stop. He wanted to situate Nkrumah in all of that history that he actually plays a significant role in. And it's a critical biography, not to mean that he's focused on all of the mistakes that were made. It's critical in the sense of, he's really trying to take account of all of this history and show not only the decisions that the guy makes, but also the context for those decisions. And in doing so, he tells a story that our people, a lot of our people, by our people here, I'm meaning, people interested in our subject matter, I think should read. And even though Nkrumah is a name that people are familiar with, like I say, in terms of really solid work that I would want to like, um, what's the word, refer students to read, I think this kind of goes to the top of the list. This kind of goes to the top of the list as far as the books I'm aware of. So the person reading this will really gain a much deeper understanding of that whole world, that whole post-World War II world where something fundamental was changing in the world, which was to say the end of the colonial empires and the emergence on the world of independent African countries and statesmen, because they were almost always men. Uh, and Nkrumah's role, like in the world, is as an influence in many places, not only on the continent, but also in America. And looking at that very specifically, all I have to say, I'm speaking a lot and effusively about, like I said, a book I just read. But in terms of talking about our subject matter, people, um, I want to recommend that to everyone who's reading this who might be potentially interested, that there's a lot to learn. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to learn even for people who are very knowledgeable about the topic as well, because Mr. French is really, I mean, I think we actually have to say, he's actually an expert, you might say, in African affairs over the past many, many decades. And um, so yeah, this is what this it's not even a book review. That was a quick book recommendation here as a thing. Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's new. Any of y'all had seen it or heard anything about it? Yo, yeah. I really do recommend it. I recommend it not just to you all, but like I say, to everyone, to your students and everything. So anyway, I mean, we're having this conversation about Pan-Africanism, and the one thing that we would say to everyone is sure it's fine to listen to people who might seem to be informed, but your knowledge will only be increased by what you go out and seek. And I know we're in the 21st century and all of that, but still, as they say back in my day, reading is fundamental.
Yeah. I
Reading
would,
is
yeah.
fundamental.
Can I say something to what you just shared?
Absolutely.
Yeah, Riff. Do they even still have Riff today? They still have the book they still have the books that come by and sell the books once, like I think once a year. But
Uh-huh.
something that you said, the way it's always when you know a lot about a subject, it's also sometimes difficult on, where do you begin? Where do we start? Where do we enter into these conversations? And in today's, and then also thinking about what's relevant and actually going on today in your life or the student's life, how do we connect them to this subject?
Yep.
And one of the things that I always start off with is knowledge of self and end with knowledge of self. And however we start that depends. But I like to do it with this poem that is in a book called the Now Civilization Contributions by Dr. Anthony Browder. And
Okay.
in that book, he's making this argument about Egyptians being Black and that so much of Kemetic culture has been infused in Western civilization, so much so that people don't even know, that its root and where it comes from. And I like to end with students going back to that same all throughout the semester. I talk to them about like beyond just this stuff that's on this board, how are you going to use this information outside of this classroom, and are you
Mm,
aware of your own programming?
mm,
That's the biggest thing that I give them right now is like, are you aware of your own programming? Because we're all being inundated with so much social media. Like we get our dopamine hits. And I tell them, including me, it's not just y'all because they can't even, the attention span is so short, to just
mm,
to focus and zero in on a subject like this that requires so much self-centered, like you being centered and like really being present in the conversation. I like to start it off with knowledge of self and just kind of talking about the things that take us away from tapping inside of ourselves and being able to connect with the next person and remembering and telling, for many of us, the students in there that identify as such, it's going to be a remembering for you. But this whole knowledge of self, this poem, and then reminding them that it really goes back to who are they and who do they want to show up in the world as, but also reconnecting that back to, again, both ideology and praxis of being someone who engages in a Pan-Africanism or understanding in general, like, how are you living out here in this world? like straight up, how are you living? Because they need to know, one, something still matters, and they need to know, two, you know, most of what you all are seeing and witnessing is the offset of the rape and pillage of Mama Africa in its truest form. There's a whole full circle. So I try to bring it full circle from knowledge of self from the beginning to the end, starting off with this poem, but also talking about people like Diop. Diop may not have considered himself or is noted as a Pan-Africanist because of his other disciplines, but him really making this argument in intellectual spaces. Because I see kind of these trains happening. We can intellectualize a conversation, but then we can also talk about our lived experiences, and folks who never entered in a classroom before are experiencing the very things these intellectuals are writing about. But and sometimes the intellectuals themselves are not actually experiencing the things they're writing about.
Okay. All right. Thanks. Yeah, so maybe we should just move on actually. But anyway, like I said, I do recommend this book. So like I say, I mean, any of this stuff, any of the things we've been doing, any of the things that we do in the classroom, as well as this series and such, just a starting point in terms of somebody actually learning something about it. I mean, so we do hope to at least be stimulated enough to have people actually, okay, go, this is something I definitely need to learn up, read up a whole lot more about. And so anyway, like I say, particularly the French book here, the Esedebe book, if you say, actually Pan-Africanism, what is it? I need to have a grip on it. I would give those two books definitely a strong look. All right, let's see what else. Let's see. We did that. We did that part. All right. So the question of when did it begin, Pan-Africanism? We're not going to do a whole history here, but I did put a little timeline up, and not going to go through all these items, but maybe highlight maybe a couple just in terms of doing historical context before we move on and talk about like, okay, does Pan-Africanism did it or did it have a particular object and such like that. So, like I said, I call it a Pan-Africanism timeline, not the, because somebody else would start it somewhere else. Mwalimu was talking about you need to go back to the Middle Passage and the solidarity and resistance among the people who had been captured and taken over to New World slavery and such like that. My timeline for everybody starts with the Berlin Conference, which is a marker for the imposition of colonialism, European colonialism over the entire African continent, virtually the entire African continent, and such like that. And it's in the wake of that you really begin to see these Pan-African sort of formations, or even before the term itself gets launched in 1900. The Chicago Conference on Africa, the African Association. But, a lot of people know about 1900, the conference that Henry Sylvester Williams pulls together in London. What else do we see here right quick? The Universal Negro Improvement Association. It actually starts in Jamaica in 1914, but it's really when Marcus Garvey comes to New York and makes Harlem his base that the Universal Negro Improvement Association really takes off in terms of becoming this mass organization that drew attention not only within the United States, but in Black populations, around the world, really. And, Marcus Garvey becoming a major figure. We might come back and say something about Marcus Garvey. A lot of people also familiar with W.B. Du Bois typically starts his story of Pan-Africanism in 1919 after World War I with the Pan-African Congress that he helps organize over there in Paris. And we'll talk about the Pan-African Congresses in just a bit. Put some other things up there. The 1945 Pan-African Congress that George Padmore organizes, or is the main organizer of, in England, in Manchester, England, after World War II, is quite notable in terms of, well, it's not quite notable in a number of ways, but certainly in terms of by that point in time, the Pan-Africanism or the Pan-African thrust being led by people from the African continent. That's a major aspect of why 1945 is important, as well as a change from notions of eventual, self-government on the part of the African quote-unquote colonies to demands for immediate or imminent independence. What else? Ghana in 1957, it can't be overstated, how important a global, how significant, how notable a global event when Kwame Nkrumah is able to actually move from this thing being a Gold Coast colony to being an independent country. That's something that, once again, the book that I was mentioning earlier, that I just finished a few hours ago, The Second Emancipation, not just that particular moment, but I mean, anyway, pays a lot of attention to that. And anyway, Nkrumah. What else I put up here? I could put a couple of initiatives. Nkrumah starts. I put up here what the Organization of African Unity 1963. We're going to come back to that and say, okay, all right, how do we consider that in terms of the history of this Pan-African initiative? What else did I put up here? Nkrumah deposed in 66. Like I said, I'm not going to go through this whole thing. And this timeline ends in 1974 with the 6th Pan-African Congress held in Tanzania in Dar es Salaam, which is, we're going to give that a little bit of attention a little bit later. We're going to pull out a quote or two that Lerone Bennett, the great Black historian, he's over there, his report on that and where that puts us in terms of talking about, where we would say Pan-Africanism, or maybe more accurately, the Pan-African movement is today. So this is just a general framework. This is not necessarily a piece for a particularly long conversation, but just in terms of the conversation that we'll go through for that will ensue here. But there's a lot here. Like I say, there's a lot here. There's a lot here. Does anybody want to react to the timeline, any aspect of the timeline, before we kind of take it into a more open conversation about Pan-Africanism, or maybe the Pan-African movement? Or maybe you want to highlight something here that you saw was particularly important. Or maybe you might have, hey, listen, here's something that was really, really important if we want to talk about the history of Pan-Africanism. That should be on the timeline. Anybody got anything? Let's say comment or addition.
For me personally, outside of vibing with Mwalimu on maybe an earlier start, but I won't get into that with you right now. But
no reason to.
But I do think that as we get into the as we cruise down here, I do think the founding of the OAAU as well matters, primarily because I don't want to give the impression that once it left the diaspora, it left it for good. I wanna show as well that these things were also happening in tandem, parallel movements happening in the New World as well as on the continent. So OAAU is the one thing within this time.
The OAAU, Malcolm X's. I just caught that.
Yes.
I caught that. Yeah. Well, okay, good. I just leave that alone because, like I said, I by definition, this was, this wasn't trying to be complete. This was just trying to have a basis for conversation. So I'm glad you put that in here. And let's see if we can get back to Malcolm X. Let's see if we can get back to the OAAU. I think we can. Yeah. All right, well, let's move on.
I was just going to add one thing, if that's okay. And it's right, like he said, not to get too deep into what the first year, but I like the acknowledgement of revolts and revolutions, and just acknowledging that Black folks who had been forcibly enslaved had been fighting against that system long before we even created something called Pan-African Studies. So we gave tribute to the Haitian Revolution. I'm thinking of Zumbi of the Palmares in Brazil, which occurred and the early 17th century, and then also thinking about the Stoner Revolution that happened just a few years after the Haitian Revolution, and the way in which we as a people may not even know each other, ever touch the land of where each other are, but there is something in our soul and our spirit that has us fight against these forms of oppression in a symbolic way. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we had resurrections, several resurrections, that would lead up to an intellectualized body to try to create something structurally. That's all. But I
Okay.
appreciate the timeline very much so. And the
Jackie,
books that you're suggesting.
Jackie, you got anything?
Nope.
You don't have to. You don't have to.
I'm
You
good.
good? You good? All right. Well, let's go to this question. So I think this becomes, I think we can get into, some different perspectives here as well. So on the question, did Pan-Africanism have a tangible object? Now here, I appreciate what you all just said about, hey, we need to go back into the days of slavery and that and such like that. So for this question, I think we just need to really consider this as a 20th century or perhaps 21st century phenomenon, just in terms of it making sense. In terms of we talk about did Pan-Africanism have a tangible object as opposed to general sentiment or ideology? And so I put that out there as a question, but you can also see by the images that I chose here, I do have a suggestion as a particular answer. What I will do before I turn it over to you guys is highlight the image in the middle, because Dr. Dream already mentioned Sheikh Anta Diop from Senegal. And you're right, when we talk about Pan-Africanism, here in an English speaking country, we really don't hardly include anything from the francophone world. And when you go over there and you check out what Jacques was up to, well before he becomes known in the United States in the 1970s as this historian, you see his career as an activist in pursuit of independence and Pan-Africanism. And this book here, around 1960, I should have checked, but this book that he writes, Black Africa, the Economic and Cultural Basis for a Federated State, he actually lays out how, in fact, this federated state, this United States of Africa notion, however ridiculed it might be by many places, he asserts, no, man, there's actually a basis with this thing. Anyway, that's the basis of the book. How persuasive it may be might, depend on who's actually the audience is, but just to make that point, that in the history of talking about Pan-Africanism, as Dream said, Dr. Diop has a place for sure. So anyway, did Pan-Africanism in the 20th and perhaps 21st centuries have a tangible object panel? What do you all think? Or how would y'all answer that, I should say?
Well, the question, the answer to that question fundamentally builds on how we began our conversation by sort of being in consensus about the wide church nature of, the broad church nature of Pan-Africanism, which means by that then to imagine a wide church having one thing that would be their tangible object, it's almost counterintuitive, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't exist as different, as different components of the broad church if indeed there was only one thing. But I do think that a large component of Pan-Africanism was the decolonization, of Africa, which, remember, that's running in tandem with, say, movements like the civil rights movement and the Black Studies movement. Eventually, these things are feeding each other in that way. But I think at least starting from right away from the beginning, because I remember in the 1900s, Henry Sylvester Williams had listed as among the goals of that to interrogate the stealing of lands in South Africa and Rhodesia, even back in 1900. Then in 1945, the anti-colonial tone really picks up. So I would argue that it's not the only one. Again, as I've couched it as being the broad church, but I think if there is anything that was very tangible, at least throughout the 20th century, the liberation, the political liberation of Africa, I think is a good tangible thing that we can point to, that because even at the founding of the OAU, that was, which we can envision as being one, not the only one, but a body that was very that was an essence, or something that represented Pan-Africanism, and that was one of their goals. So, I think that was a big one indeed.
Anybody else want to answer that one?
Yeah, I would agree with him. It is definitely varied, right, by faction. So, as he mentioned, decolonization, and then that impacts us on many levels, right? So, yes, ending colonial rule, looking specifically at how to become an independent nation. But I think, just to tie into what he was saying, social, economic, and cultural, as well as the political liberation for the people and the land, along with the diasporic allegiances that have been made and continue to be made over time, which has helped to demystify the lies that we don't like each other, we don't want each other, we're not connected, we are not the same. Because in these times, some people still believe things like that, that Africans in different countries on the continent don't like African Americans and have negative perceptions, and Black Americans don't feel whatever, however they feel. So that continued of diasporic allegiance and unification that we've seen in terms of Nkrumah and Du Bois, and even just women, but through the arts, I want to just highlight the cultural as well as the social, political, and economic um, liberation that our colleague just mentioned.
Jackie,
So
what would you answer? How you answer this?
yeah, I would say I don't think the United States of Africa was the actual tangible object. I don't think that was the one goal that everybody had. Um, but I do think that some form of independence was what everyone wanted. But I think that the part of the issue, that's gonna happen when you're dealing with a whole bunch of people, is the way to get that looks different for each different group. So while there may have been like that common end goal, how you strategize through that depends on each individual situation. So I don't think that there could have ever been a collective, we're all going to do this, because one shoe doesn't fit all in these types of situations. So I do think that it was tangible, but I don't think that we could have any type of uniform or universal approach to reach that goal. So even when it comes to like the way that we may support, the way we may support one country is going to look different than the way we support another country, but we're still supporting. And even if you just like look only in the U.S., the way people may need support in Kentucky is definitely going to be different than the type of support that's needed in like Texas and then Iowa, right? So I think that those types of things is like, yeah, we all may have the same goal, but the way we get to that goal looks different. And that's something that has to be appreciated and also discussed at length.
I heard that. I heard that. Um, hey y'all, here's a piece of poetry I just discovered recently, you know? And so uh, uh, our man Marcus Garvey, the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, in 1924, he writes this piece called Hail, United States of Africa. And I mean, it's more famous slogan, Africa for the Africans, and there's a whole lot to say about Marcus Garvey, his actual ideology regarding how Africa was to become free, what it would look like when it was free. There's a whole lot to say about that go beyond what we have a chance to get into. Um, but I was struck by this early articulation, this notion of the United States of Africa, and he's going to actually kind of go through. It's kind of going to go through all of those colonies, and I do not present it to you all to try to press a case necessarily for Marcus Garvey's artistic brilliance. That is not my point. But that was an interesting document in light of the conversation. And yeah, United States of Africa. So what do I want to say here? Um, despite the fact of how very, very different these two people were, and they're in a different historical space, but really very, very different people. Marcus Garvey and Kwame Nkrumah. And Nkrumah stated, and you can see a lot of ways in which it was true, that Marcus Garvey, the dreamer, the utopian dreamer, was really quite a large influence in terms of shaping. Not the only one by any means. There are a whole lot, but a significant influence, including things like the Black Star, which is the image I have behind me, the flag, and all of that. But anyway, like I say, originally I did maybe have the idea to get Jakia to read a couple of these verses for us, but I was like, I'm not that mean. I'm not that mean, so I'm not going to do that.
I really
Anyway.
appreciate that, but I was expecting. I'm like, he about to ask me to read this. But to this, I was gonna say to what you said though is, Nkrumah talked about how Marcus Garvey was one of like the biggest influencers in his life.
Yep.
But this is just going back to some academic stuff for like how we learn. For folks who don't really work with primary sources, they will miss those small things and those connectors of people. So yes, we're in different decades, but if you had read the work of Nkrumah, you would have seen the influence of Garvey that Garvey had on him. And I personally really do think that they had similar motives, which was more than just the United States of Africa. I mean, I think they were setting themselves up to try to be leaders of this United States of Africa, my personal opinion. But just to see, like looking at Nkrumah, we talk about Nkrumah a lot, but we also have to talk about what and who influenced him. And that time in the United States was a huge factor for many reasons, and Marcus Garvey was definitely one of them.
Facts. So anyway, so Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association, certainly a part of the story, of Pan-Africanism, if you're trying to tell a story in the 20th century, certainly. Even though if you go back and ask Marcus Garvey about this phrase particularly, well, if you ask him about the Pan-African Congresses, he really would have nothing but very critical things to say. But in light of history, we see the connections that at the time, like I say, various political and doubtlessly personal and cultural dimensions, might have made that a little bit more difficult in the actual contemporary situation. But in history, we do see that. So we're going to um, spend a few moments with this contemporary initiative of the Universal Negro Improvement Associations, which is to say the Pan-African Congresses that Du Bois is going to be the major figure of starting in 1919 and through the 1920s. First to note, as we see here, the aforementioned Henry Sylvester Williams, who was from Trinidad, actually, but certainly He's the one largely responsible for the 1900 conference, the Pan-African Congress. He's the leading figure in that earlier organization, which actually like brings, what puts on, is that the right way of saying it? That makes that conference happen, the African Association. And so anyway, in terms of Pan-African entering the lexicon, we usually credit this 1900 conference in London that was held there as well. And Du Bois, W. Du Bois, who will be the major figure in the 1920s Pan-African Congresses, certainly, usually gives a sentence or two to that in terms of talking about where the name and the lineage of Pan-African with the Pan-African Congresses that start after World War I in 1919 and extend through the 20s. And what do I want to say? I mean, well, the first thing to say would be, just as the Universal Negro Improvement Association faced tremendous repression and suppression by the powers that be, the United States government, as well as the colonial powers who control not only his native Jamaica, but all throughout the continent of Africa, which he, as Jakia alluded to, claimed to be the provisional president of. Just as they faced tremendous repression and suppression, so too did the Pan-African Congresses. Certainly, too, did the various powers that be as well want to make sure, not that there was a tremendous chance that it would happen, but wanted to make sure, that these things had no influence. Which, anyway, blah, blah, blah. I'll stop that story there. Once again, getting back to the whole thing of talking about like reading. So, man, this book here, The World in Africa, that Du Bois writes in 1946. So that makes it, what, 80 years old? Is that right? Is my math right? Just about 80 years old? And still to this day, as someone who like teaches in Black studies, in terms of a one-volume history of Africa, this is still my go-to book. I am aware, I'm not to say this perfect, nothing's perfect, but it's held up remarkably well 80 years later, and I'm not aware of anything superseding it, in overall quality and value. So another recommendation, if anybody's listening is unfamiliar with, Du Bois's, I mean, he's got so many things right, but The World in Africa, this is that. So it's still, as a one volume account of the continent, is still quite valuable. Like I say, I'm not aware of it having been superseded. But also, then we're going to talk about these Pan-African Congresses now. And so in the last portion of the book, one of the last chapters, he kind of gives us an account, or he kind of runs through some of those efforts in the 20s. And he gives us some documents. Gives us some, some excerpts from some documents, so we can actually kind of get a sense of what these people were articulating, in these congresses and such like that. So I want to turn to that. Although I might have said something y'all might want to respond to. If so, let me hear it. But I want to take a look at some of what the Pan-African Congresses were saying. As we are, I mean, I guess this is still under the general question of what is Pan-Africanism? What was my question? Did it have like a tangible object and such like that? Yeah. So Du Bois gives us the demands, the resolutions.
Yeah, I think they were. I think they were the resolutions or something. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, demand sounds a bit strong because, well, anyway, I'll leave that one alone. And he says the one in 1921, which we see here, was essentially what was the same as the one from 1919. And so I want us to look at that stuff right quick, just in terms of, okay, here's what the Pan-African Congresses, right, were making a claim. We're not going to read all of these items at all, because there are like 9, 10. But I'll just highlight a couple as we look. And so like the one from 1919 as well as the one from 1921, he says we start with principle number 1, the recognition of civilized men as civilized despite their race or color. Point number 2, local self-government for backward groups. Deliberately rising as experience and knowledge grow to complete self-government under the limitation of a self-governed world. And then we go to education, freedom of religion. Point number 6, the return of Negroes, the return to Negroes of their land. And I'll stop it there. And so, in my courses, we spend a whole lot more time than we are definitely going to spend here. We're not going to hardly spend any time on this notion of this question of civilization, this question of civilized men, this question of people who are civilized being treated as civilized. We're kind of going to leave that one alone today, just because that'll take up the whole rest of the what are we doing? Of the event, of the program, of the conversation. I would highlight, number 2, this certainly is not independence, right, that's being asked for, but I would highlight this just from the standpoint, point number 2, local self-government for backward groups. Once again, that there's that civilization part, which I don't know if we want to entertain that one too much right now, just because it's really quite fraught. But in terms of why I tend to associate Pan-Africanism specifically with the colonial problem, the problem of colonialism in Africa, is because of this sort of focus. And like I say, the timing kind of lines up. But yeah. They certainly are not at that point, making any claims for self-government. But you see that the problem of Africa being colonized is, in fact, a major aspect of the Pan-African Congresses. And I'm just running the last 2 and then turn it over to you all if y'all have any reaction to it. In 23, a couple of years later, it's tweaked a little bit. Number 1 item. Well, at least that civilization piece is no longer number 1, right? But anyway, a voice in their own government. And there, the object could be the United States as well as the African colonies. Number 2 does seem to be specifically talking about the colonies, the African colonies, the right of access to land and its resources. We go down to number 5 before we come back to Africa, particularly the development of Africa for the benefit of Africans, right? And I'll leave that one alone, and then we'll move to the next one, and it's tweaked just a little bit, but still, collectively, this gives us a sense of, okay, what are these resolutions? What are they claiming? What are their assertions in terms of what needs to happen? So anyway, we stay with a voice in their own government as item number 1. And we just kind of tweak point 2. It's still basically the same. Native right to the land and its natural resources, modern education, development of Africa for the Africans. And that point about civilized men being treated civilized, at least it's gone down to point number 6 in 1927 there. But I highlight these in our conversation to really come back to the question of the centrality of the issue of colonialism in Africa, back to the question of talking about a tangible object for Pan-Africanism. But anyway, there's some stuff. There's some interesting stuff, a part of our history that y'all might have some reactions to. And what you got? Yeah. Let's talk about some of this.
I'm very intrigued, Doc, by your centering. And I think it's a very justified centering, but I do want to interrogate it a little bit. Centering the movement on the colonial and anti-colonial sort of moment here. There's a quote that stood out to me as I'm reading this page you have up here. That's at the bottom of the 1921 section, where they're talking about this conversation happening. And gradually they began to distinguish, right? These folks began to distinguish between the Pan-African movement and the Garvey agitation. They praised and criticized. Sir Harry Johnson wrote, "This is the weakness of all the otherwise grand efforts of the colored people in the U.S. to pass on their elevation and education and political significance to the colored people of Africa. They know so little about real Africa." Be
Well,
that as it may, we can discuss the veracity of that very declaration. But it did strike me as being very interesting, particularly because this is this is this is this is this is this is Jim Crow America. This is that space.
yep.
And I was just wondering if the orientation really then was, despite the deficiencies maybe pointed out by Johnson here, regarding how much people know,
Yeah.
that was center stage, um, at the expense, or maybe not at the expense, because I know this whole movement was also going on, but was the fight for equality over here also not that? Or was that a different thing, or was it part of two sides of the same Pan-African coin, as it were?
I'm not sure what you're asking me, actually, honestly.
What I'm asking is, in the 1920s, given one, what Harry Johnson here says about that weakness, and two, given that it was of the essence that it still is, but especially 1920, it was of the essence that Black America be pushing, or the Black world be supporting Black America's effort towards ending Jim Crow, towards better in that era. So it strikes me as very interesting that in that very moment, right, the eyes are still facing Africa. If you continue to center decoloniality as the center, decolonization as the center piece of the Pan-African movement, even back then,
Yeah.
when you had a lot of business to handle at home, and were somewhat handicapped by the weakness pointed
Okay.
out here, So I guess that's what I'm saying.
Okay, I think I may grasp it. Well, so I mean, in the person of W.B. Du Bois, obviously, we're speaking of someone who had, very strong commitments to the struggle for equality in the United States throughout a long career. So when we talk about the Pan-African Congresses specifically, that one particular aspect of his activism, I mean, like I said, if we're just looking at this stuff, I mean, uh, yeah, if you're talking about the Pan-African Congress and their articulations, sure, the question of the treatment of Black Americans is on the table, but to me, these resolutions kind of speak for themselves in terms of the centrality of, I'm repeating myself, of the colonial problem. Like I say, I mean, I don't recommend that we spend any time getting deep into like what they mean when they talk about the recognition of civilized men as civilized despite their race or color. But that is very pointed. I mean, specifically, that's really talking about personal experiences of people like himself, and sure in other places, sure in Europe, but primarily in America. Well, mostly in America. That's where he lived in America. Um, but yeah. The Pan African Congresses did not have as their any particularly primary planks, you know, any particular laws being changed in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, like I say, yeah, I think
I'll,
I'm just
I'll
repeating
add a
myself, so
little
I'm
to
going to
the
stop talking.
conversation too. I'll add a little. So thinking about the fourth Pan-African Congress that happens in 1927, if they're at that particular time, they're focused on African independence, they're focused on autonomy. In America in the 1920s, we're dealing with the Great Depression, but also the New Negro movement and the Negritude movement, for example, in Paris. So the New Negro movement being all about, at the basics level, not even thinking about um, state's independence versus a person's self-autonomy, independent autonomy to be seen as a human being, because what was written in the Constitution is that Black people were 3/5 human beings. So Black people were still at this basic level of one having to redefine themselves for themselves, that they were human beings, that they were intellectual beings, that they had a level of superiority to their existence. They were trying to refute that. That was all coming in response to they're uncivilized, they have no culture, slavery helped them. It was all in response to some of those very, very problematic notions that had been used as a justification for the scientific, the racist science that was being created as factual evidence to justify the inhumane treatment of Black people. So they were just at a point of like, wait a minute, we don't have to see ourselves in the way in which the white man sees us. We can actually see ourselves as intellectual beings. And that was happening on the individual level through the spaces of education that would filter into community. But for this Congress, they were arguing for autonomy, like independence. So the reflection and the connection between the two is one is just at the basic level of see me, recognize me, which is why we see in 1921 and 1927 the treatment of civilized men as despite differences of birth, race, and color. That's in all three of them. Where it falls in the list of resolutions is different, but they were literally still at that basic point. And also at this particular time, we had the international Black womanist theory that was arguing that the Pan-Africanism was still highly patriarchal and still wasn't equitable for women, and that it needed to be more intersectional and bring in more of the other aspects of our identities. So there is a mirror happening, but I think on the ground level, the poorest of the poor were advocating just to be seen as human beings, and then having to say, well, you're not going to see me as that, so we're going to define ourselves and see ourselves in this way, where this particular Congress is looking at how we can move towards autonomy, independence as the continent and the different states on the continent.
Well, that's one of the big differences when we go from the 20s to 1945. We spoke about it earlier when we were doing the timeline. But, the Fifth Pan-African Congress in 1945, although it's still, like the other ones before, it's still held in one of the European, not capitals, but in a European city.
Interesting.
So this is the first time that, like, it's predominated by Africans, and not only Africans, but Africans who have come as representatives of various organizations. A lot of people, trade union. George Padmore here, we mentioned his name earlier. He's the primary organizer. And anyway, let me stop doing that background. But all that to say, members of trade unions as well as political parties and organizations. And when we tell the story of Pan-Africanism, we mark the 1945 conference or Congress as people coming out with marching orders, really seeking immediate or at least near immediate independence. And of course, over the next 20 years, the vast majority of these European colonies in Africa have now become these fledgling nation states. And so, yeah, the 1945 Congress, this is actually, due to George Padmore's, what's the word, patronage, we would say. Uh, this is really how Kwame Nkrumah, who spent the last, 10 years or so in the United States as a student and just trying to get by. This is how he really becomes to play a prominent role in the international Pan-African movement there, And anyway, there's a whole long story there as well. But in terms of, like I said, just in terms of charting this basic story, the 1945 Congress is considered one of the major turning points, if you will, right? And then Shingi earlier mentioned, um, a moment which certainly has to be um, um, discussed or considered in terms of talking about this Pan-African movement that we've been talking about a little bit is, like I say, in 1963, there's an organization created called the Organization of African Unity. It dissolved in the 90s and became the African Union, uh, fairly similar organization. But anyway, 1963, as we marked on that timeline that we were dealing with some time ago, very significant. And so the question that I posed back in May, and I'll pose it to you all because I do think we'll probably see some, what's the word, divergence of opinion here, is should we consider the creation of the organization African Unity an advance for the Pan-African cause, or perhaps something else, perhaps a defeat even?
Now we're getting
Uh,
to the good stuff.
yeah, for real, for real. Yeah.
I would
So
love to hear what you all have to say about this, because when you teach this, it sounds like, in theory, a great organization. This is when it's in the OAU stage and then it becomes AU. But what
yeah,
I also pay attention to is what has historically been given space is things that align with dominant white society's ideals. And so I think about an NAACP. It sounds great, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. However, it's also arguably cloaked in respectability politics that end up denying the essence of Blackness in some ways. And I question whether or not the OAU, which then becomes the AU, is really on the side of the African who they want to liberate, especially when they fire people like Dr. Ericana for saying a speech, and who, from my understanding, was the former AU president in 2019, but then says a speech and then she gets fired because she addresses colonial rule in the phase of neo-colonialism. So it's interesting. Are you for the people, or are you not for the people? So I would love to hear you all's opinion on it, because I can acknowledge some great things that they do, but also could question the foundation of their value system as well.
yeah. Um, Shingi, yeah, because I think you probably would have an opinion that's quite different from mine. What are your thoughts? It sounds like you might tend to think that the OAU represents an advance for the Pan-African cause.
Uh, it's tough, right? Because I think when sometimes when you account for the imperfections of things, right? Two things can be true. In by that I'm not just doing this to play the middle ground here. I'm saying we can talk about the fact that it was an advance of sorts. But when you get 5, when you were looking for 15, 5 is an advance. It's not a but it's also not the win you were going for. I do think there was a lot of intentionality that went into it, right? With the blocks, the Casablanca Monrovia blocks, the fact that they were able to come to the table and come together and sort of come together with something that was workable, right? That sustained, and really to even talk about the fact that it became the vehicle through which a lot of the decolonial movements were couched, for the rest of them that were still going into the second half of the 60s and beyond, that were still colonies. So I want to give it credit for that, for the fact that it could have torn the continent right apart before we had even gotten started, but something worked, and for that purpose. Now, then we get into the end of apartheid. We get into third wave, what I call third wave Pan-Africanism. If again 1945 marks sort of the beginning of the second wave, then the end of colonialism, and say, as we get into the 21st, marks the advent of the third wave Pan-Africanism. That I'm not sure about. I'm not sure about. I really was hopeful when they made some of the tweaks that came with the AU, that we would get a more people-centric versus leader-centric movement, bottom up as opposed to top down. That we would get more. Even the conversations we were talking about when you talked about Dr. Arikana who was the she was the ambassador. She was the ambassador to the US, I believe, the AU ambassador to the. But yeah, you know, the diagnosis was spot on, and I remember we had just met her a couple months ago, and we were glowing in praise of her, right? As the African graduate students at Michigan State at the time. Then we hear that she's like, what could she possibly have done? Then you hear the reason, you're like, oh, it's still that part, or it's still that game we were playing. I thought we were winning now. So, so there are those things, right? And that is not, again, to also be clear, that is not a separate point from the fact that 80+% of the funding comes from is external funding, right? So what are we even doing? You know what I'm saying? Like when we don't control, and I'm saying I don't have the answers to this, but yeah, somebody's gonna pull your strings, right? So
money question.
Indeed. So
yeah. I mean, I think she even I mean, she's addressed it multiple times, but I mean, she did say that she was ousted not because of even the other folks, the part of the AU, but because of those external figures. But my personal opinion is that the OAU was better than the AU. Not by much, but at least it was slightly better. But to what Shinya was saying, I think the biggest issue that we have is that so much is just a top-down approach, which is why Garvey was so successful, because he was speaking to the everyday person. And I think the Pan-African Congresses were a complete failure, except for 19, a complete failure. I mean, anybody who knows me knows that I'm not a big Du Bois fan, but a big part of it is I'm not elitist. Like when I think I'm better than people, it's because I am as a person, not because of degrees or anything. Like it's actually just my like actual character and personality. So I just don't like the elitism, and that's what the Pan-African Congresses were. I mean, and even in that book, even Du Bois said that he eventually changed his own perspectives on what would be best way for Africa to be liberated, because he thought that it would need to come from the West. Like he thought that, you know, if you were born and raised and schooled in the West, then you would like have this knowledge that you know, that other people may not have. So that elitism, I think, was the biggest stab in the foot that prevented progress, real progress, because they were incapable of speaking to the people. Real change happens when everyday people all join forces. That's what we're seeing in Burkina Faso right now. Like in Burkina Faso, you have a large group of people who are supporting their president, right? And are like working together. That's how you build success. That you have to inspire people. You don't just pass it down. That's what I think the Pan-African Congresses were doing, which is why nothing ever happened. And I think the OAU may have wanted to do something different, and then all they did was conform, essentially. I mean, and I think the other thing too is that this is something that we see is very common. Like we saw, like Nkrumah as an example. I mean, Nkrumah could inspire anything and anyone, right? He really just had that, and he was a visionary. He was intentional about building networks to kind of have this broader reach. But we saw after time went on, he changed too and things got to his head, right? So I think it's the same thing of when we look at the OAU, is that they may have started with the best intentions, and then it ended with a lot of arrogance. And now we have the AU, which is, I think, just a reflection of a lot of African politics, where you have many people in power who are puppets of the West, and they could make drastic changes in their countries if they were actually autonomous, but they choose not to be autonomous, line their pockets and the pockets of their families while they're the rest of the folks in the country just get whatever dust and dirt is left over. And I think the AU unfortunately does represent that because it's top down. I don't know what they do. I mean, if somebody can tell me 5 things they have accomplished, then I will be willing to be persuaded. But I have yet to get that. Besides giving resolutions, they love having talks and they love having meetings. But what is actually done? What big changes have been made when you have over 50 countries here together, saying that they go work together? So that's where I'm at with it.
I heard that. Well, you all said a whole lot. I gave y'all a 1963 question, and y'all took it up 60 years to the current day, and that's good. That's useful. That's part of the conversation. Um, how would I address this question? When I pose this question to you like that, should we see the OAU as an advance for Pan-Africanism or as a defeat for Pan-Africanism? And the truth is, and I will admit it today, that is a very partisan question. That's a very partisan question that obviously holds that there was something that could have happened instead of the OAU. So it's a partisan question because I clearly seem to be siding with the Casablanca group in terms of the competing viewpoints of as these countries are becoming independent. And if we might put a to define that conflict, whether or not the next phase after independence was some sort of continental authority, which is what Nkrumah and Touré and a couple others were saying this is the direction we need to go in. And these other people, like my man down the Ivory Coast, Houphouët, I don't know how to pronounce my man's name. Actually, I'll stop it there. Who else? Senghor. Who else? Tubman. These people said, no, man. Now that we have, national autonomy, now that we have control of the government, we're not ceding any authority. We need to create just a community of nations who have general goals. So that's really the way the OAU went. You can talk about the Casablanca group and the Monrovia group coming together and compromising. But I mean, my reading of it is that really the conception of the Monrovia group, that you'll have a loose organization that does not have as a goal some sort of, continental authority. And this is where it's going to go. So it'll be this week, it'll be this, well, now I'm getting editorial. It'll be this loose association that won't have any authority, any teeth to enact any of its recommendations, that will really not be doing anything to affect any sort of, accumulation of continental, power or capital. I can't really say capital. That will kind of leave in place these very strong situations of dependence, economic dependence between these ex-colonies, most of these ex-colonies, if not all of them, and the former colonial power, and you just move forward that way. And so that's, like I say, so the question is kind of a partisan question. It's kind of you might even argue it's an Nkrumahist partisan question in terms of how that notion, will there be a continental authority? Will there be some sort of federated state, as Diop says? Will there be some sort of United States of Africa, as Nkrumah and others thought? And, the answer in 1963 was no, it won't be. And so a lot of the things, not all, but a lot of the things that you all said when you all kind of brought the history up from then to at least close to now, really follows from that original conception of what the thing is. What is the thing itself, right? And so there's that. Let's turn, since we have a historical bent here, let's turn to something else I discovered recently in putting this thing together, this conversation together today. The noted and important African-American historian Rayford Logan was one of the many Black Americans who spent a significant amount of time in Ghana, and was very much interested in African affairs. And in 1965, um, you know, he had a bit of a take. So he wrote this piece, which I think is definitely worth you all reading. Um, Historical aspects of Pan-Africanism, a personal chronicle. I just wanted to pull out a short section just to read it for us as a part of this conversation. All right. And so I shall do so. In the context of independent nations, Pan-Africanism takes on a wider meaning, but in my opinion, the probability of Pan-African unity will remain very slight for some time to come. Certainly, I defy anybody to see in the Organization of African Unity the basis of the United States of Africa. The necessary executive, legislative, and judicial powers are simply not there, even though unity is proclaimed as the ultimate goal. Looked at realistically, however, the present structure of the OAU is about as far as the African nations can go at this time in the direction of unity. He has more to say, but he says, hey, this is not really that Pan-African vision, but they probably can't do much more than that, you know. And if I bring it back to the book I've been mentioning this evening, Horace, Howard French's book, The Second Emancipation, as he's discussing Nkrumah's statecraft, okay, once you actually take over now, what do you got, right? Now that you've actually taken over this ex-colony, how do you actually move from all the stuff you're talking about, like empowerment? How does it actually happen? And just one of the general points, and I'll stop here. One of the general points that he, I think, maybe was reluctant to and took a long time to come to, but something that a lot of people kind of recognize is that leaving aside questions of like personal ego, leadership, power, and all that other sort of stuff, these ex-colonies were all such incredibly weak uh, entities, weak institutionally, infrastructurally, politically, educationally, economically. And so trying to turn those things into like viable, uh, you know, economic and political entities, a modern nation state, which actually can, to some degree, defend its people against international forces, in this case, international forces of capital. And was something that, that already was such a tremendous job. And then to say, okay, well, let's now try to create a continental entity on top of these extraordinarily weak institutionally entities was it's extraordinarily visionary. And so, I mean, that's history teaches us that. But there were people who were saying that back then also. And so, like I say, you have a voice like Logan pointing out, saying, uh, it sounds good, but do we really understand what it means for all of these African political parties to take over these ex-colonies, which is to say ex-dictatorships,
Well,
and
and can I
actually
add to that?
forge anything called a modern nation state? Okay, I'm done.
Yeah, no, I want to add to that because I think that, you know, I think it is important to say ex-colonies because before these weren't the nations, right? Before these
They
were
were
not
not
like
nations.
these borders were created by Europeans. So it's I think it's a bit, I don't know the word I want to use, but I do find it problematic to just assume that because a nation has independence that there is no nation building that needs to take place. This is the first time that we are all trying to build a national identity as one, because before we were separate, and that was okay. Like, it wasn't a problem. It was just like, no, we didn't have to think about this, right? So trying to,
Jackie,
huh?
let me interject. Just let me add a little bit. I'm gonna let you get back.
Yeah,
But
yeah, go
to
ahead.
your question of talking about nation building, you said we are all building this nation as one. Well, that's just it. Because these are these arbitrary ex-colonies. Actually, you have all these competing forces, ethnic groups. People are not building, the new nation state as one. One of the storylines, I was aware of it, but Howard French made it much more clear in this book, The Second Emancipation, is how from the very beginning, not even from 57, but from 1951 even, Nkrumah had like intractable enemies within Ghanaian society. People, groups who were never going to work with, groups who were committed to him failing from 1951, not even 57, 1951. So just to the question of, are these ex-colonies actually viable nation states? Do you actually have, upon independence, do you actually have people collectively trying to build that thing? All right,
Mm-hmm.
back to you.
Yeah, no, very good point. When I say we all, I don't mean all the people. I think I mean more all the leaders of those areas trying to build their nations. But yeah, it's like now you have to in some way persuade people to see themselves as a part of something with other people that they maybe didn't have to interact with, or interactions may not have been positive. And sometimes maybe they were good, right? But that's the situation that you in. So it's very difficult to say I'm gonna that everybody on this whole second largest continent of the world is all also going to see themselves as a singular identity of African and Pan-Africanist and this and this and that, when
Right.
like we we have things closer to home that we need to work through and try to build up. So I think that that's one of the pieces that people don't think about a lot. And I'm like, it's not even complicated to imagine. If you go into any type of diverse space, you will see that it takes work to build that space and to bring these people together. It just takes work and it takes time. So it's just on a larger scale when we're talking about these new nations, with the borders that were created by Europeans. So, and I mean, in dividing, I'm like, we're dividing ethnic groups and things like that. And they're like, no, my cousin live across the street, but technically they have a different nationality.
Mm,
How? Make it make sense.
yep.
Like, it literally
Yep.
doesn't add up. So I think that honestly, what would have been, what it would have been the best course of action, or maybe a better course of action, I don't know, but would be to redraw the lines.
Mm,
But
mm,
that requires letting go of some land and letting go of some potential power and things like that. And they may not have been, these African leaders may not have been willing to do it. And I'm like, if you're not willing to do that, then how cohesive do you really want the African continent to be? Which is why I think that the United States of Africa could never be a reality, because that means going back to, we need to go look at every area specifically, and maybe do some, maybe have some agreements and change our borders and go back to, if maybe not the way they were completely before, but even go to something a little more similar to that, because that's actually African. So trying to build a United States of Africa based off of European borders, I think the foundation was always going to be off. So it was never really going to work.
that's true. Well, yeah, yeah. Shingi, you
You know,
got
no,
thoughts?
I mean, I concur with the logic and the thought process, but I do worry a little bit that we speak a little bit like um sorry, I just got distracted by the message that came in here, uh as if we are fresh out of colonialism. And I know 60 years, 70 years is not a crazy amount of time, but it's also been that. And I wonder if we are not giving credit to the fact that national projects have existed. Nation building, it may not have been that exact way we are talking about to say, let's redraw the borders, at least for most places. But, it seems like the implication is folks got these nations and just kind of sat down. But we do know, right? Whether it's Ujamaa, whether it's for better or worse, we can discuss the outcomes of that. But the whether from Ujamaa to rainbow nationalism to this and that project. So, you know, I think maybe might not have been the national project that would have fostered the United States of Africa per se, but it reminds me a little bit of the Frantz Fanon quote about the ancestors and what was given, doing what they can with what they had at the time without, what I'm saying, because it's just hard for me to say, even though there's been failures, to say that folks got these nations and didn't make attempts at nation building for the post colony. You know what I mean?
Oh, let me clarify.
Nobody was saying that.
Yeah,
Nobody
definitely was
saying
not
Yeah,
saying
that was
that.
a conversation then. Yeah.
No. So what I was saying was really responding to the piece before by Logan, but that was written in 1965. So I'm talking about in 1965, we have to keep in mind that they were in the process of nation building.
Okay.
So
Okay.
those folks
fully
were
understood.
always
Okay, that is correct. That part.
Yeah. No, that was what I meant.
Well, folks,
I do want real quick. Sorry,
time
before
is
you
just
go,
about.
I do wanna bring this thing up to say that we had a student who was who's been asking some things in the Q&A, and I wanted to at least if you could maybe take a look at that, and there's at least one question in there that came in like 10 minutes ago.
Yeah, not right now, because we are running out of time. But I do want to get a little bit more on the table. We'll run over a couple minutes, but hopefully we can get to it. Just in terms of this timeline, though, we talked about 1963 and the Organization of African Unity, and you all, like I said, you brought out some of the implications of today. Um, so I think something else that's a part of the conversation in terms of talking about Pan-Africanism, as opposed to the general question of the health of African societies, which I think we may have started talking about here in the last couple of minutes. But on this Pan-Africanism question, so 1974, the Sixth Pan-African Congress held in Dar es Salaam is very important historically. And actually, the aforementioned Marlimu Horace Campbell, he was there because, there were a lot of people from America who made it over there. And so I sent this to you guys. It's an interesting read. The great Lerone Bennett chronicled the 1974 Pan-African Congress. And some of the points you all are making, like I say, some of that plays out here. So before I read this little paragraph here from him, just to say, we're still talking about like collective action today. So talking about like the essential contradictions, the contradictions in terms of what, basic economic outlook. You can talk about contradictions in terms of alliances with foreign sources or potential sources of capital. You have that. But the Sixth Pan-African Congress had all of that, as well as the essential conflict between liberation movements and state governments. And it was a noble attempt of the Sixth Pan-African Congress, but that contradiction, or should I say that conflict between state governments and activists who believed in liberation and various aspects of reform, overthrowing of or at least eliminating corrupt governments, etc. And so one of the big problems with the Sixth Pan-African Congress, and this is one of the criticisms from a certain perspective, it really kind of just turned into another OAU meeting, because even in terms of organizing the thing, that was really a big kind of sticking point. Who's coming? Is it going to be dominated by these heads of state, these governments, or this larger movement of Black people, including forces within some of these governments who are fighting against these governments, because of their corruption and bad politics and such like that. And, the perspective that held that you really had to create space for these governments, what's the word, carried the day and really kind of determined ultimately the outcome, I should say. And really, like I say, you see my timeline ended in 1974, because after that, you really saw the contradictions, not only the ideological conflicts, but also, like I say, by 74, you had these independent governments, in some cases for 15 years. You had all that sort of entrenched power. Let me read a couple quotes, and then we'll get to that statement or that question. Let me read a couple of quick quotes here from Lerone Bennett, as one of our major figures here as well. All right, here, let me see. I need to get this over here so I can read it, brother. What brought them all together and held them together, at least for 9 days, was the Pan-African idea of the liberation and unification of Africa and the regeneration of Africans and peoples of African descent. And there's another quote in here I want to give you all. So I'm going to read this two paragraphs there. I just want to read the last paragraph, just in terms of, like I say, this is from the history standpoint, understanding where you might call the Pan-African movement was in 1974 with the Sixth Pan-African Congress. And like I said, we actually got a lot of veterans out here who actually were there. Anyway, let me read that last paragraph. So there it was then. There was not going to be a permanent Pan-African Secretariat. There was not going to be a Pan-African Center of Technology. There was not even going to be a Pan-African movement. By inadvertence, the draft copy of the General Declaration contained language referencing the Pan-African movement. The delegate from Algeria gained the floor and reminded the vice chairman, Marcelino dos Santos, that it had been decided that all references to the Pan-African movement would have to be deleted in favor of the word Pan-Africanism. And so I guess, I sort of had this perspective without knowing that specific piece of information. But in terms of, how I've kind of presented what my conception of the thing is in terms of talking about the Pan-African movement. And, this is kind of, after 74, I do think we have to refer to it as a historical phenomenon. By the way, in the background, we have pictures from the Black American delegation to Dar es Salaam. And the only face here that's visible that I definitely clearly recognize, that I can identify, I should say, Hoyt Fuller, the extremely important, influential editor out of Chicago. I know this face, but I can't call his name. But anyway, in terms of why I frame this stuff and say 1974 is actually a good stopping point, it's for some of the observations actually that are made here by Mr. Bennett in 1974. Here's some questions we're not going to have time to get to. As a matter of fact, I will stop this and bring it back for us. And anyway, 1974, I don't know if you all thought much about that in terms of where that is in history, but in terms of how that, portends the last 50 years in terms of how we really cannot speak of anything you would call a Pan-African movement, anything that you would call a, sort of a collective, tangible goal that Black people might be seeking, Yeah, I'll stop there actually, because we're already running over time.
Yeah, I personally, if I ever talk about the Pan-African movement, I'm specifically talking about Marcus Garvey. I think that, yeah, that's it. That's all. I think everybody else had, they wanted to start a movement, but they didn't. So, there were ideas, there were thoughts, there was energy, but there was no mass group working towards the exact same goal that was clear. I can see to get from point A to point B. that was the only person who was able to do that was Garvey, which is also why I think people like Du Bois didn't care for him, because this was a man who didn't need 8 billion degrees and could move people and inspire people and make things shake. So, and I can I respond to that Q&A real quick?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, just very quickly. He basically, well, they basically said, does the Bible Pan-Africanism focus on catching up with the West or forging our own pathways? And I don't know what there is to catch up to. So I don't think that we need to quote unquote catch up to the West or try to copy the West at all, because it not only is it not the center of the universe, but there are so many issues. And also we are talking about nations that developed because of Africans. So they are only where they are because of us. And many of them are only continuing because of us, because of continued exploitation, and in particular. So I think that we need to make our own pathways, and we can have, and I mean, I think we just need to make our own pathways, because look at the way that we've built the world everywhere else. So we can continue to build us, because we have proven to be innovators for centuries. And I would also say, I think if anything, if there was any area to look at, to be in collaboration with, it would be the East. It would definitely not be the West.
I heard that. Well, we are like past our stopping point, so I think we should really just offer some. I know we left a whole lot on the table, but we're at that point where we just kind of need to, I guess, wrap up actually. So,
Okay, my
Dr.
wrap up.
Jen, yeah.
I'll just say in my wrap up, one, thank you all for the conversation today. Always, stretching. People who talk about this all the time, it's good to talk about it with other people and how they see it. I think, to answer your question, like, is there a common objective today? I feel like, even though I don't agree with it, I hear a lot of people talk about like economic liberation, and that's been kind of like my criticism over these movements in general. This idea that once you have a certain amount of money in your pocket, you're free of having to deal with systemic racism and any type of oppression. I think that is one that people tend to focus on. Not necessarily saying that's one that I agree with. Well, I understand we need economic liberation. I don't think it is the answer for complete liberation, because to me that's still wrapped up in capitalism and a side effect of white supremacy in some ways. I do believe in self-determination, and I do like each nation state getting to decide for itself what it needs, because to me that's a more equitable approach to what we have learned over time with all these movements, because they all start and die in the same way, always from the inside. It's always one of us turning on one of us for this. And my last message to the people who are listening, it's not about the people, it's about the mission. So stay focused on the mission, don't get caught up in the people.
I heard that. I appreciate it. Shingy, where you at?
Thank you so much for having me. I think that.
Oh, Shingy, there was something in the chat you thought we needed to get to?
Oh no, that was what I think what Jackie addressed earlier. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Indeed. Yeah, that was it. Yeah. Um, yeah. No, I think my the big thing that I wanna, and this is in addition to everything else that's been said, is the idea of form following function, which is to say that I do wanna, I think a large part of the work that we may have to do is in a bid to make Pan-Africanism a little less reactionary than it's historically been. Is I think we need to have the pre-existing relationships as opposed to trying to find each other when it's going down, so to speak. So I think if we can if we can really be intentional in fostering Pan-African community, right? That way, I don't call you up when I have a problem, and we're trying to build from that moment on. We already like an actual community. We confront these things with community already in mind, and I think that'll be, for as long as we are reactive every time there's a flare up here. There's this issue that's come up in the U.S. or in Ghana or in Sudan or in South Africa or in Jamaica. We're like, all right, what are we gonna do now? Who are our friends? I don't think that's the time to ask who our friends are. I think we should, who are our brothers? That if we can focus on, in almost like in the off season or all the time, if we're always building community, stay ready so you don't have to get ready, like we say. And I think that's one of the things that I really want to foster, that we continue to build. We are very intentional about crafting community, not for the purposes of crisis, but because community is good to have, and also will help us with the crisis, indeed. So
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And that just kind of reminds me of, like, when we talk about being in community, again, that's why I think that when we talked about like the top-down approach of Pan-Africanism, it doesn't work because it doesn't foster community. It's paternalism. So in being in community, I think the other thing too, we have to remember that we cannot be in community with those we don't know. And to that, I mean, we have to be intentional and take the time to get to learn. We have to open our hearts, open our minds, open our books, and learn some things. Because a lot of that reactionary behavior that we've seen, I think in the past few years, for me, it's been a little shocking, only because none of these things are new. None of these things are new. But there's a but people are just now learning. I mean, I would at least hope that people are trying to learn histories, trying to continue to learn, and will keep the same energy in the years to come, because that's the only way that we can support each other. So when there is a call, hey, I need you, you already understand the situation because you took the time to get to know your neighbor. You took the time to get to know and to be in community. And then remember that I saw somebody say this once, is that a lot of people want community, but they don't want to be community. Right? Like, you just want to take everything, and you never want to give, and you never want to sacrifice. But I think that's part of it. And I think that's how we see Pan-Africanism realized and in reality, is by showing up. And showing up don't always mean being in the forefront. Showing up could just mean reading the book. Showing up can mean coming to these types of talks. Showing up can mean asking questions and celebrating one another. And that's how we begin to grow and actually see those drastic changes.
Well, I like what y'all had to say. Yeah. And we said we'd have a two-part conversation, Pan-Africanism and then like Black Studies, and we never we never got to the Black Studies part. And not only that, we never even began to finish the Pan-African Studies part either. Which is, I mean, that's not really a big surprise. I mean, these are large topics. Every time we do these things, we know we're going to leave a lot on the table, and certainly we did. But I do thank my panelists. I thank all of y'all quite a bit. Shingi Mavimi, Dr. Dream, Dr. Andrea Smith out there, my pal, Jakia Marie. I thank everybody for listening, checking out the event. We'll get it posted up on YouTube as well. So if there's somebody who might be interested, we should have it up there on the playlist fairly soon. I got to get this one up there as well as the last one we did on the Black Arts Movement. That's about it. We're over time, so I mean, there's not really a whole lot much more for me to say, except thank everybody very much. I thought it was interesting too. So I hope all of us got something out of this conversation, and PAS and Friends conversation Black will continue in the new year. Everybody have a wonderful end of the year and a great beginning of this next year that's about to begin. And like I say, we'll certainly be back in the mix in January, I'm pretty sure. So, yeah, I think I just got to say bye. Bye, everybody. Y'all have a good one.